There was once a man who lived in a grand mansion at the edge of the city. He was a millionaire, known everywhere for his wealth, his luxury cars, and his endless parties. People bowed their heads when he passed, and many whispered with envy about his fortune. Yet behind all the glitter of his life, he carried a shadow. He was not a kind man. Instead, he was proud and arrogant, treating those below him as if they were invisible. Among the many people working in his mansion was a maid named Clara. She was young, humble, and quiet. Every day, she dressed in her plain uniform, carrying out tasks from early morning until late at night. Clara polished the silverware, scrubbed the floors, and dusted the shining chandeliers that hung like stars above the dining hall. She never complained, though her hands often ached and her back grew tired. The other servants in the house often kept to themselves, afraid of drawing the master's attention. For when the millionaire grew angry, his voice was sharp, and his punishments were harsh. Clara, however, remained calm. She had learned long ago that silence was her best shield. She walked with her head lowered, obeyed every order, and kept her thoughts locked away in her heart. But Clara was not as ordinary as she seemed. Hidden deep inside her was a secret world that nobody in the mansion knew about. She loved music. It was not just a hobby for her, it was her soul's language. When she was a little girl, her late father had once taken her to a small concert in the town square. She remembered the sound of the piano keys dancing in the night air. From that moment, she had fallen in love. Life, however, was not kind to her. She was born into a poor family, and when her father passed away, Clara had no choice but to leave school and work. She could not afford lessons or instruments. Still, she held on to her dream. With every coin she saved, she bought second-hand books about music. Old torn sheets of paper filled with notes became her treasures. And one day, after years of sacrifice, she managed to buy a broken second-hand piano. It was far from perfect. The keys were chipped, and some notes were out of tune. But to her, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every night after finishing her long day of cleaning and serving, Clara would sit at her little piano in her small rented room. She would close her eyes and let her fingers play. The tiredness in her body faded when the music began. Through her music, she spoke to the stars outside her window, telling them her worries, her hopes, and her hidden strength. Still in the mansion, no one knew. To the millionaire and his wealthy guests, she was just a servant, someone who poured wine, served food, and disappeared into the background. Nobody imagined that this quiet maid carried a gift that could move hearts. Clara herself never revealed it, partly out of fear, and partly because she had grown used to being unseen. The millionaire's house was often alive with grand gatherings, nights filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and music performed by hired musicians. Clara would walk silently through the hall, carrying trays of golden plates and sparkling drinks. Sometimes she would pause for just a second when the piano played, her heart aching to touch the keys. But she always reminded herself of her place. She was only the maid. The millionaire himself never paid her much attention. To him, Clara was like the furniture, useful but unimportant. He never imagined she had a story, let alone a hidden talent. His world was full of people like himself, rich, proud, and blind to the beauty hidden in ordinary souls. And so Clara lived between two worlds. By day, she was a silent servant, moving like a shadow through the mansion. By night, in the quiet of her tiny room, she was a musician, her soul alive in every note she played. She dreamed secretly that one day her music might be heard, but dreams, she reminded herself, were dangerous for people like her. The world she lived in had no stage for a poor maid. Little did she know, life was already preparing a moment, a night when her hidden world and the grand mansion's glittering halls would collide, a night when her music would no longer belong only to the stars outside her window. But for now, she remained the invisible maid, polishing silver for the arrogant master, carrying trays past the wealthy guests, and keeping her secret locked safely within her heart. Clara's life had never been easy. From the very beginning, she was born into a world where every day was a battle for survival. Her family lived in a small wooden house at the edge of the town. The roof leaked when it rained, the windows rattled when the wind blew, and food was often little more than bread and soup. Yet inside that poor home there was warmth. Clara's mother filled it with love and her father with music. Her father was not a professional musician, but he loved to play. Sometimes he borrowed an old guitar from a neighbor, and on quiet evenings he would strum it softly while Clara sat beside him. She would hum along, her little voice carrying dreams bigger than her age. But when her father fell ill, everything changed. Medicine was expensive, work was scarce, and Clara watched helplessly as her family's world crumbled. Within a year, her father was gone, and her mother, left weak and tired, depended on Clara for everything. At an age when most children were still in school, Clara was already working. She gave up her books, her pencils, and her classrooms, and traded them for buckets, mops, and endless chores. She cleaned neighbors' houses, carried laundry baskets twice her size, and sometimes even skipped meals to make sure her mother had enough to eat. Her hands became rough and her back ached, but her spirit refused to break. Inside her heart, she still held on to music. When her mother's health worsened, Clara made the hardest choice of her young life. She left her home and moved to the city, hoping to find better work. The city was loud and fast, filled with people who didn't care about the struggles of a poor girl. For weeks she searched, knocking on doors, asking for jobs, and being turned away. Finally, she was hired as a maid in the mansion of the millionaire. At first, Clara thought it was a blessing. The pay was small, but it was steady, enough to send money home for her mother's medicine. But the mansion was another world, and Clara soon discovered how cruel it could be. The master of the house was proud, the kind of man who believed money made him more important than others. He treated his workers like shadows, expecting them to serve without voice or question. The other servants were older and had learned to survive by staying silent. Clara followed their example, never speaking unless spoken to, never raising her eyes higher than the floor. Each day was the same. She would wake before sunrise, sweep the marble floors until they shone, polish silverware until it sparkled, and wash endless piles of linen. Her hands were often red and raw, but she kept working. She knew she could not afford to lose this job, not when her mother's life depended on her wages. Even when the guests arrived for the millionaire's grand parties, Clara was there, moving silently with trays of golden dishes. She was invisible to the crowd, just another servant blending into the background. Sometimes she overheard cruel jokes, laughter about poor people, and careless words about servants like herself. She swallowed her pride and kept her face calm, but inside her heart ached. Still, Clara had one secret comfort. After the long, exhausting days, she would return to her little rented room on the edge of the city. There, waiting for her, was the second-hand piano she had bought after years of saving every coin. It was old, some of the keys were chipped, and the sound was far from perfect. But to Clara, it was a treasure. When her fingers touched the keys, the weight of the world lifted. In those quiet nights, music became her escape. She played softly so the neighbors would not complain. Each melody carried her pain, her love for her mother, and her hope for a brighter tomorrow. The piano became her diary, her secret voice telling stories no one else could hear, yet she knew the truth. To the world, she was only a maid. People looked at her uniform and saw nothing more. They didn't see the girl with dreams, the girl who could make a piano sing. Clara told herself it was safer this way. If no one knew, then no one could take it away from her. But deep inside, she longed for just one chance, one moment where her music could be heard, one moment where she would not be the invisible maid, but Clara, the girl with a gift. She did not know it yet, but fate was already preparing that moment. A night was coming when her secret world would be forced into the open. A night when her struggles, her silence, and her music would collide in front of the very people who mocked her. For now, though, she endured, carrying trays, scrubbing floors, and bowing her head. Every coin she earned went to her mother. Every note she played at night kept her spirit alive. Life was hard, yes, but Clara's heart beat with quiet strength. She was more than what the world saw. She was waiting for her moment, even if she didn't know it yet. The mansion was never quiet for long. The millionaire loved to show off his wealth, and almost every month he held grand parties. People from the highest places in society attended. Politicians, businessmen, famous artists, and rich families. They came in shining clothes, expensive jewels glittering under the chandeliers, and their laughter echoed through the golden halls. To them, the mansion was a playground of luxury, a place where food and wine flowed endlessly. For Clara, these parties meant harder work. From morning till night she prepared the house, polishing every corner until it sparkled, arranging flowers, and helping the cooks in the kitchen. On the night of the party she wore her plain uniform, carrying trays of food and drinks, walking carefully so as not to draw attention. She was not part of the celebration. She was only part of the background. This particular party, however, was different. The millionaire was in a proud mood. He had just closed a deal that made him even richer, and he wanted everyone to admire him. He boasted loudly about his success, about his power, about how everything in his life was proof that he was above others. The guests laughed and praised him, clinking their glasses, eager to stay in his favor. But behind his laughter there was arrogance. He enjoyed making people feel small, especially those who worked for him. That night, as the music played softly, and the guests gathered around the grand piano, the millionaire's eyes fell on Clara. She was moving quietly across the room with a tray of glasses, trying to avoid attention, but he noticed her. A thought struck him, a cruel idea to amuse. "His guests?" He called out her name sharply. Clara froze in her steps, every head in the room turned toward her. The tray in her hands trembled, and she lowered her eyes. "Come here," the millionaire said, his voice filled with command. The guests waited curiously, some smirking, others whispering. Clara stepped forward slowly, her heart beating fast. When she reached him, he pointed toward the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black wood that shone under the lights. "Play something for us," he said. His tone was not kind, it was mocking. He wanted to turn her into a joke, to show his guests that even his maid could be used for entertainment. The guests laughed at once. The idea of a maid sitting at such a fine piano seemed ridiculous to them. They whispered loudly, enough for Clara to hear. "Does she even know which key to press? This will be funny." A servant at the piano, imagine that. Their laughter stung, but Clara stayed quiet. Inside her chest, her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. She had played the piano many times in her small room, but never in front of anyone, and certainly not in front of such a grand audience. She knew the millionaire expected her to fail, to stumble and make a fool of herself. That was why he had chosen her. It was his way of proving his power. For a moment Clara wanted to refuse. She wanted to shake her head and say no. But she also knew what would happen if she disobeyed. The millionaire's temper was dangerous, and her job was her lifeline. Without it, her mother's medicine would be gone. She could not risk it. Slowly, with trembling hands, Clara set down the tray and walked toward the piano. The crowd's laughter followed her. She could feel their eyes piercing her back, judging her, waiting for her to embarrass herself. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Her knees shaking, her fingers hovered above the keys, cold with fear. The room grew quiet, though not out of respect, but out of curiosity. Everyone leaned closer, eager to witness her humiliation. The millionaire smirked, raising his glass as though he had already won. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. She remembered the nights in her little room, the chipped keys of her second-hand piano, the way music had always been her escape. In that instant, she decided, if this was to be her humiliation, then she would let her heart speak one last time. Her fingers touched the keys, soft at first. The first notes floated into the air, unsure, hesitant, like a whisper in a storm. The guests chuckled again, but then something changed. Clara's trembling stopped. Her body remembered the hours she had spent alone with her piano, the countless nights of practice, the tears she had turned into melodies. The sound grew stronger, clearer. Her music began to fill the hall, and the laughter faded. The guests stopped whispering and turned silent. They were not expecting this, not from a maid, not from someone they had dismissed as nothing. The millionaire lowered his glass slowly, the smirk on his face fading, as the power he thought he had began to slip away. And though Clara was still afraid, inside her she felt a spark. For the first time, Her music was being heard, not by the stars outside her window, but by the very people who had mocked her. She played on, every note carrying her struggles, her pain, and her hidden strength. Clara sat at the grand piano, her hands shaking slightly as she placed her fingers on the keys. Around her, the wealthy guests were already laughing. Their laughter was not kind, it was sharp and filled with mockery. To them, the idea of a maid playing in their presence was a joke. Some covered their mouths, pretending to hide their smiles, while others spoke loudly enough for Clara to hear. "What? Can she possibly know about music?" one man said with a chuckle. "She probably thinks the piano is just another piece of furniture to clean," another woman whispered, and her friends burst into giggles. "This will be entertaining," added an older gentleman, raising his glass of wine. The laughter spread across the room like fire. Clara could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her. It was as if the entire hall was waiting for her to fail. The sound of their laughter echoed in her ears, making her chest tighten. Her heart beat faster, her throat felt dry, and she wanted to disappear. At the back of the hall, some servants peeked in from the corners. They knew what was happening. They had seen the master's cruel games before, their eyes filled with pity. But they could not help her. They too feared the wrath of the millionaire. They stood in silence, wishing Clara strength, but unable to show it. The millionaire himself leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. He raised his glass of wine and looked around as though to say, "Watch how I control even the smallest life in this house." He enjoyed the scene. He enjoyed the power. He believed he had already won. Clara's hands hovered over the piano. She felt the sting of humiliation before she had even played a single note. The laughter cut deep into her heart, reminding her of every time she had been dismissed, every time she had been treated as invisible, every time her dreams had been called foolish. For a moment she almost gave in to the fear. She thought of standing up, bowing, and walking away, letting the millionaire have his cruel victory. But then she remembered her mother, the tired face that always smiled for her despite the pain. She remembered the nights she had sat by her broken second-hand piano in her tiny room when no one was watching, when no one laughed. Those nights had not been for anyone else. They had been for her. They had kept her spirit alive. She could not throw that away now, not even in this cruel moment. So Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the mocking faces around her, shutting out the laughter, shutting out the smirk of the millionaire. She took a slow breath. Her fingers pressed down on the first key. The sound was soft, barely above a whisper, and some guests laughed even louder. "Listen, she's too afraid to play," someone sneered. But Clara did not stop. She continued, letting the notes flow. Her trembling began to fade with each sound. Her hands, though shaky at first, began to find their rhythm. The laughter in the room grew quieter, not because the people wanted to be kind, but because something strange was happening. The music, though simple at the beginning, carried an emotion that they had not expected. Still, the crowd was not fully silent yet. Some tried to resist the pull of the music. They whispered to one another, "It's just luck. She must have memorized one piece." Others laughed nervously, as if trying to hold on to their pride, but their laughter no longer rang with confidence. It sounded weaker, like they themselves could not believe what they were saying. Clara kept playing. She imagined herself back in her little room, where the cracked walls surrounded her and the stars shone through her window. She was no longer in a grand hall filled with cruel eyes. She was in her safe world where music was her language and her freedom. With each passing note, the weight of the laughter grew lighter, and her confidence grew stronger. The guests shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. Without realizing it, their eyes fixed on her fingers. The arrogance in the room began to fade little by little. The same people who had laughed moments ago now sat with their mouths slightly open, unsure of what was happening. They were caught between disbelief and wonder. The millionaire frowned. His smirk slowly vanished. He had expected his maid to stumble, to make a fool of herself, to bring more laughter to the hall, but instead something he had not planned was unfolding. Clara was no longer the helpless servant in front of him. She was becoming something else entirely, someone who dared to shine in a place that had tried to dim her light. And though the sound of laughter had not disappeared completely, it was fading. Clara could feel it. She could sense the change in the room. Her humiliation was turning into something else. The crowd that had once mocked her was beginning to fall silent, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Her music demanded it. The first sound that came from the piano was soft, like a whisper in a crowded room. It was not grand or heavy, but it was real. Clara's fingers trembled as they touched the keys, yet even with her shaking hands, the notes carried a strange beauty. The guests leaned back at first, ready to laugh again, thinking it was only a lucky start. But then the second note followed, then the third, and something in the air began to change. Clara kept her eyes closed. She knew if she looked up, she would see the stares, the smirks, the cruel faces waiting for her to fail. She blocked them out and thought only of her little rented room, the broken second-hand piano that had been her only friend. In her mind, she was not in a golden hall filled with rich strangers. She was home, playing to the stars that had listened to her for so many nights. At first, the melody was fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind, but with every passing moment her hands grew steadier. The music began to rise, filling the great hall with notes that seemed to carry her soul. The guests shifted in their seats, their laughter fading into silence. They had expected clumsy noise, but what they heard instead was a story told through music. Each key she pressed seemed to speak. It spoke of her childhood, of the nights she had gone to bed hungry but still dreamed of melodies. It spoke of her father's old songs, of her mother's tired smile, of the loneliness she had faced in silence. The guests could not understand why their hearts were stirring, but they felt it. Some looked at one another in surprise, as though asking silently, "Is this really happening?" The millionaire watched closely. His smirk was gone, replaced by a frown. He had planned this as a moment of humiliation, a spectacle to make his maid look foolish. But the longer Clara played, the more he realized that the joke was no longer hers. It was his. Still, he sat back, unwilling to admit defeat. Yet he could not deny that something powerful was unfolding in front of him. Clara's body relaxed as the music carried her. The fear that had frozen her chest melted away. She no longer felt the weight of the wealthy crowd's judgment. Her fingers danced with freedom, creating sounds that seemed too pure to come from someone they had called just a maid. She let her heart speak through the piano, and her heart was louder than any laughter. The first notes turned into a flowing river of sound. They grew stronger, bolder, lifting the silence higher and higher. The chandeliers above sparkled as if they too were listening. The guests, who had once leaned back in their chairs with mocking smiles, were now leaning forward, unable to look away. The hall that had moments before echoed with laughter was now filled only with music. Some of the guests felt an unexpected sting in their hearts. They had never thought about the lives of servants, never imagined their struggles, but Clara's music painted it for them without words. They could feel the pain, the longing, and the quiet strength woven into every note. The maid they had mocked was becoming a storyteller, and they were the listeners. Clara did not know how long she had been playing. Time seemed to disappear. Her hands moved on their own, guided not by memory but by feeling. She was no longer afraid. She was free. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. She was not just a maid. She was Clara, a musician. When the last notes of her first melody rang out, the hall was frozen in silence. It was not the silence of mockery. It was the silence of awe. The guests stared at her, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide. No one dared to laugh anymore. The music had taken away their arrogance, leaving them speechless. Clara opened her eyes slowly. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. She had done it. She had shared her secret. She had played not as a servant forced to perform, but as a soul demanding to be heard. She looked around, and for the first time she saw no smirks, no cruel smiles, only silence, the kind of silence that meant she had touched their hearts. Diwan, millionaire, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could feel the weight of the guests' gazes. They were not looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. His plan had turned against him, and though he tried to hide his anger behind his wine glass, inside he burned with embarrassment. He had wanted to humiliate her, but instead she had humiliated him without saying a single word. Clara lowered her hands from the piano. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply sat there quietly, as if the music itself had spoken enough. In that moment, she understood something. Her worth was not measured by her uniform, or by the way people looked at her. Her worth was inside her in the gift she had carried all along. The music filled the great hall like sunlight pouring into a dark room. The guests who had once been laughing now sat frozen, their eyes fixed on Clara. No one expected such beauty to come from the hands of a maid. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for her touch, waiting to be brought to life. The air felt heavy, not with laughter anymore, but with wonder. At first, the guests did not know how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide the fact that they had mocked her just moments ago. Others leaned forward, pulled closer to the sound without even realizing it. The whispers and sneers had vanished, replaced by silence so deep that even the crackle of the candle seemed loud. Clara had taken control of the room, not with words, but with the voice of her soul. Her fingers danced across the keys. The music rose higher, stronger, carrying emotions that words could never express. The melody spoke of pain, of long nights filled with tears, of dreams hidden in the dark. It spoke of hope, too, of a spirit that refused to break. The crowd could feel it even if they could not explain it. They were no longer watching a servant. They were witnessing an artist. One woman, dressed in a gown that sparkled with jewels, felt her throat tighten. She remembered the way she had laughed at Clara earlier. Her laughter now seemed cruel in her own memory. She lowered her eyes, ashamed. A man near her who had made jokes about servants sat with his lips pressed tightly, his glass of wine untouched. He too felt the sting of guilt. The maid they had laughed at was showing them something greater than all their riches. Even the millionaire sitting at the head of the hall felt the shift. His smirk had long disappeared. In its place was a tight jaw and a forced smile. He looked around and saw that his guests were no longer admiring him. They were admiring her. The power he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. His plan to humiliate Clara had turned into his own humiliation, but he could not stop it. He could only sit and watch as she stole the night. Clara herself felt the change. When she had first touched the keys, fear had held her tightly, but now it was gone. The music had carried her away from fear, away from doubt. She was no longer a maid in a uniform. She was Clara, the girl who had dreamed of music since childhood. Every note was a declaration that she existed, that she mattered, and that her voice was strong. The hall seemed to breathe with her. The chandeliers glittered as if they were listening. The polished floors reflected her image, making her seem larger, stronger, more radiant. The silence of the audience was not heavy anymore. It was full of respect, full of awe. Clara could feel it wrapping around her like a warm cloak. She had been invisible all her life, but now she was the center, and no one could look away. When her melody softened, the room leaned with it. When it rose again, hearts in the audience rose with it. She was guiding them without words, pulling them through her struggles, her pain, her dreams. Many of the guests had been to concerts before, had heard famous musicians play, but none of that compared to what they were experiencing now. This was not performance. This was truth. A servant at the back wiped a tear from her eye. She had known Clara for years but had never known this part of her. She felt proud, as if Clara's courage was also hers. The other servants, hidden in the corners, exchanged glances filled with amazement. For the first time, they saw one of their own standing tall in front of the very people who had always looked down on them. Clara was playing for all of them, giving them a voice through her music. By now, not a single person in the hall was laughing. The same mouths that had once mocked were now silent. The same eyes that had rolled with arrogance were now wide with wonder. The transformation of the room was complete. Laughter had been replaced by reverence. Cruelty had been replaced by respect, and the maid they had dismissed had become the star of the evening. As the final notes of her piece drifted into the air, the silence that followed was even louder than applause. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment Clara felt the greatest victory of her life. She had silenced not only the room, but also the doubts that had lived inside her for years. She had proven, to them and to herself, that her talent could not be hidden forever. Then, slowly, the applause began, soft at first, then louder, rising into a thunderous sound that filled the mansion. Guests stood to their feet clapping, some even shouting in praise. The very people who had laughed at her were now cheering for her. Clara sat still, her hands resting gently on the keys. She did not smile widely or bow deeply. She simply looked up, her eyes shining, knowing that the room had changed forever. When Clara's hands finally lifted from the keys, the music lingered in the air like a dream that no one wanted to end. For a few seconds, the hall was frozen in silence. It was not the silence of mockery anymore. It was the silence of awe. Then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, but it grew louder. Another guest joined, then another, until the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. The guests who had laughed at her earlier were now standing, clapping so hard that their palms turned red. Some even shouted words of praise. Brilliant, unbelievable, extraordinary. Their faces glowed with excitement, completely forgetting that, only moments ago, they had treated her as nothing more than a maid. Clara sat quietly on the piano bench, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She looked out at the sea of faces, unable to believe what she was seeing. Among the crowd, a few guests felt shame burning in their hearts. They remembered their cruel whispers, their mocking words, and now they wished they could take them back. One woman wiped away a tear, her jeweled necklace shimmering as she whispered to herself, "How could I have laughed at her?" A man near the front bowed his head, unable to meet Clara's eyes. His arrogance had been shattered by her music. The millionaire, however, sat stiffly in his chair. His plan had turned against him in the worst possible way. He had wanted to humiliate Clara, to use her as a source of laughter for his wealthy friends. Instead, she had humiliated him. The attention that should have been on him, the respect he demanded from his guests, had been stolen by the very maid he had mocked. His face grew red, his jaw tightened, but he could do nothing. If he showed his anger, he would look even smaller. So he forced a smile and clapped lightly. Though inside he was boiling, Clara lowered her gaze humbly. She did not raise her chin with pride, nor did she bask in their applause. She simply folded her hands on her lap and sat silently. Her music had been her answer, her truth. She didn't need to add words. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen, and that was more than enough. One of the guests stepped forward, a well-known music teacher from the city. He was a man of influence, respected in the world of the arts. He approached Clara with eyes full of wonder. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. Clara hesitated, her voice trembling. "I never learned," she admitted. "I only practiced alone." The teacher shook his head in disbelief. "You have a gift that the world needs to hear," he said firmly. The crowd murmured in agreement. Many guests whispered about opportunities, about concerts, about lessons she could receive. In that moment, doors that had always been closed to Clara suddenly began to open. She had been invisible only minutes before, but now she was the center of attention. Her music had forced the world to notice her. The servants standing at the edge of the room looked at Clara with pride shining in their eyes. For years, they had lived under the shadow of the millionaire's arrogance, ignored and silenced. But Clara had broken that silence with her courage. She had shown that even those at the bottom carried greatness within them. One of the maids whispered to another, "She played for all of us tonight." The other nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. The millionaire noticed the shift too. He saw how his guests no longer looked at him with admiration, but at Clara with respect. He felt smaller than ever before, but he could not stop it. The room had transformed and he had lost control. He sipped his wine quickly, hoping to hide his embarrassment, But no wine could wash away the sting of his failure. For Clara, the night was like a dream. She had walked into that hall as a servant, meant to be ridiculed, but she had left her mark as a musician. Her heart still pounded not from fear anymore, but from triumph. She knew this moment would never leave her. The laughter she had once feared had been silenced, replaced by applause that echoed in her soul. As the applause finally began to fade, Clara stood slowly from the piano bench. She bowed her head slightly, her eyes lowered. She did not seek glory. She had never played for fame or recognition. She had played because music was her truth, and yet, in sharing that truth, she had changed everything. The guests began to talk excitedly among themselves. Some wanted to meet her, others wanted to know her story. A few even promised to help her study music properly. But Clara simply stepped back, her humble nature shining through. She did not know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. The world would never see her as invisible. Again, the night of the party became a turning point in Clara's life. What had started as an attempt to shame her had turned into a moment of triumph. The guests who once saw her as invisible could no longer ignore her. They had been silenced by her talent, touched by her music, and moved by the story hidden in every note she played. The memory of that evening would stay with them for years to come. Clara walked back to her small room later that night. Her steps were slow, her heart still racing. She carried no prize, no gold, no jewels, but inside her she carried something far more precious: dignity. For the first time she felt the strength of her own worth. She had faced laughter, she had faced mockery, and yet she had risen above it, not with anger, not with revenge, but with her gift. She sat down at her little second-hand piano, the same broken one that had carried her through lonely nights. She ran her fingers gently over the chipped keys, remembering how this old piano had been her only friend when the world turned its back on her. Now she knew those nights had not been wasted. Every note she had played in silence had prepared her for the moment she stood before the crowd. Word of Clara's performance spread quickly. Some of the guests told others about the maid who had stunned a hall full of wealthy people. They spoke of her passion, her raw talent, her ability to make even the proudest hearts humble. Soon, musicians in the city wanted to meet her, teachers offered her lessons, and opportunities that had once been impossible slowly began to appear. But Clara did not let fame change her. She still wore her plain uniform, still walked quietly through the mansion's halls, still sent her wages home for her mother's medicine. Yet something was different now. People looked at her with new eyes, the servants whispered about her courage, the guests greeted her with respect instead of dismissal, and even the millionaire, though bitter, could no longer treat her as invisible. He knew that his attempt to humiliate her had instead revealed his own arrogance. Clara often thought back to that night. She remembered the sting of their laughter, the weight of their judgment, and the fear that had almost made her run. But she also remembered how the music had carried her through, how it had silenced every cruel word. She realized then that talent, when guided by courage, had the power to break walls that seemed unbreakable. Her story became more than just her own. It became a message to everyone who felt small, everyone who felt invisible. Clara showed that worth was not written on fine clothes or in the weight of gold. It was hidden in the heart, waiting for the right moment to shine. She proved that no matter how lowly the world may see you, dignity and talent can rise above status. Her mother, too, heard of the night. When Clara returned home and told her everything, her mother's tired eyes filled with tears. "I always knew you were special," she whispered. "Your father would be proud." Clara hugged her tightly, knowing that all her struggles had been worth it for this moment. Her music had not only changed her own life, it had given hope to the one person she loved most. And in the quiet of her nights, Clara still played for the stars. She no longer played only for escape. Now she played to celebrate, to remember, to give thanks. Her music had once been her secret, but now it had become her voice, a voice that reached beyond her little room, beyond the walls of the mansion, into the hearts of all who heard it. As years went by, people often spoke about the maid who had silenced a crowd with nothing but her piano. Some told the story as a lesson in humility, Others told it as an inspiration to never underestimate anyone. Clara herself never boasted. She never needed to. Her legacy was not in words. It was in the memory of that night. The night when laughter turned to silence, and silence turned to thunderous applause. Clara had lived through poverty, through hardship, through mockery, but she had found her strength. She had discovered that true power does not come from wealth or status. It comes from courage, from passion, and from the ability to stay true to oneself. That was her legacy, a legacy born not of riches, but of resilience. And so, the maid who had once been invisible was invisible no longer. She had become a light, reminding the world that greatness often hides in the most unexpected places, reminding them that respect must never be measured by status, but by the spirit of a person. Clara's music lived on, not just in the notes she played, but in the hearts she touched, in the silence she created, and in the lesson she left behind.